A split verdict. At 4:46 p.m., a jury found one Aurora officer, Randy Roedema, guilty in the 2019 death of Elijah McClain. The other, former Aurora officer, Jason Rosenblatt, not guilty.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Randy Roedema, guilty of criminally negligent homicide. Jury verdict for the charge of assault in the second degree. We, the jury, find the defendant, Randy Roedema, guilty of assault in the third degree.
Roedema, the one found guilty, will be sentenced in January. My colleague Chris Vanderveen, you've followed this case closely. And I remember in 2020, we're in the newsroom, the protests of 2020 were going on, and you pointed this case out as something that we were hearing about George Floyd, but no one was at that moment talking about Elijah McClain.
At least not nationally, and this is an important distinction. In that time in 2020, there weren't a lot of people that were talking about nationally about the Elijah McClain case. That all changed near the end of those, beginning at the middle of those protests, where people started to talk about it a lot, and eventually it became a national story. But for about 8 or 9 months, this country largely did not know of the Elijah McClain case.
That seems bizarre, too, at the time with a death like this. And I know you've looked into the reports, the autopsy reports, the conflicting autopsy reports that I guess caused some consternation probably with this jury because it took many days to come up with this split verdict.
That was a very, very difficult aspect of this case, is that you had essentially one autopsy and then you had an amended autopsy done by Dr. Stephen Sini in the Adams County Coroner's Office. The first autopsy said, we really don't know how he died. The second autopsy said, I think it was ketamine. But the problem was, in this case, who administered the ketamine? It wasn't the police officers. It were the paramedics that were involved that are going to be tried later, and that was a complicating factor. Now, clearly, the jury today said, we believe that one of those officers, Randy Roedema, was criminally responsible for the death, but they also said another officer is not.
They got conflicting testimony from this trial of one said it was just the ketamine that killed McClain. Another part of the testimony from someone else was it was a combination of the ketamine and the officer's actions.
That's why you suspect it sort of took a long time for this jury, at least a couple of days, 2 days and a half to sort of reach this verdict, is because it was a complicated case that involved all of those factors. In the end, the jury seemed to say, we believe that maybe the ketamine was responsible, but we also believe when it comes to Randy Roedema that the restraint, he was the one that had him on the ground. Jason Rosenblatt had walked away from the scene for a while, and because of that, they seem to be putting a lot of the criminal responsibility, in fact, all of the criminal responsibility when it comes to these two officers, on Roedema and not on Jason Rosenblatt. It's an interesting verdict today, but if you start to pay attention to the case, you see some of the dynamics that makes the jury's verdict possible.
This was the result of a grand jury indictment, and I've heard if you want to get an indictment from a grand jury, you just have to show up, and you're probably going to get that indictment. But then you actually have to go to the trial.
And then you have to go to the trial. This is a victory in small part to the AG's office that was urged by the governor's office to, in fact, bring this indictment forward. You have to go back to 2020 when the governor injected himself into this conversation and said, we need to go to a grand jury. Phil Weiser brought the case to a grand jury. Grand jury issued indictments. And today, at least in part, that decision by the governor and by Attorney General Weiser does come to fruition in terms of leading to at least one conviction.
We're going to look more at that timeline in just a moment. Thank you, Chris.
You bet.